Hi guys, we're talking about statistically significantly different, data that's really, really different, and data that is different but not really, really different. So this picture shows statistically significantly different data. We know the data is statistically significant. That's actually different because this standard deviation and this standard deviation have no overlap. So if I follow this line across, I can see this line, this standard deviation line, the very top of it, does not cross the standard deviation of the other data set at all. Same way, if I look at the minimum standard deviation of this data set and go across, does not overlap the standard deviation of this data set at all. This data is really different. This bar is low, this bar is high. In fact, this data is so different because there's no overlap that the data is statistically significantly different. So what does it look like when data is different, but it's not statistically significantly different? So these bars are different. They're not the same height. However, the standard deviation of this data and the standard deviation of this data do overlap. So the data is different, but not statistically significant. Okay, these differences are not statistically significantly different. So if I go to the top of this standard deviation and go across, I can see it's overlapping the standard deviation here of the other bar. Right there, as soon as there's any overlap, I know the data is different, but not statistically significantly different. Okay, there's no statistical differences. So here, this bar, if I go across, does overlap this bar. Actually, most of this bar overlaps this bar. So this bar here, if I go across, does overlap this standard deviation. Because the standard deviations overlap, there is no statistically significant deviation. This is like the black car and the green car. Yeah, the average ages were the same, so the bars would actually be the same in that case. And they had different standard deviations. But those cars were so similar. You could tell both of those cars probably had a family in them. There's two 42-year-olds. There were two people in their late 30s, early 40s. There were kids in there that were under 13 in both cars. Okay, the cars were different, but they both probably contained families. So they really weren't that different. On the other hand, this slide is much more similar to the standard deviation from the black car with the family and the gray car with the college students, right? There was a very different average. The data here, it had a different, the data here, the standard deviation for the black car did not overlap the standard deviation for the gray car. Those are just analogies. That's not actually the standard deviation of those bars, right? Those are just analogies, but they help us keep in mind, right, what's statistically different and what not statistically different really mean. Okay, so let's look at some more complicated data. So here, the question is 0 electron volts versus 800 electron volts. Is the data statistically significantly different or not? So I see down here we have